Hiya, welcome back. This is part 3 of the rebuild series, and I'm going to show you it hasn't gone as smoothly as I'd hoped. There's a big hole where the engine should be. Gearbox is on the floor. So what's going on? Let's take a look. So the engine was in. It was all buttoned up, all connected. Everything was ready to rock and roll, filled with oil, filled with coolant, and I had a lot of help from Clint Gaskin from Brands Performance, who helped me get the Link ECU set up and running. We corrected all the parameters and I was ready to fire the thing. I fired it and it fired up straight away and sounded pretty sweet, to be honest. I checked my oil pressure gauge and it wasn't where it should have been. Okay, let's go for a start up. Engine stone cold. Right mate, so I've been checking with the Cosy Bible and above -12 I should be running 2050, that's what they said back in the day, and the minimum oil pressure at 850 RPM should be 26 psi and at 2000 RPM should be 34.8 psi, and that's at 80 degrees C with 2050. So while I was at the factors I found that they had this stuff. It's German stuff. They reckon it was the bollocks. It's mineral braking oil and it's 2050, so a lot thicker than the stuff that come out of it. Engine's cold. Let's give it a start. Sound a bit quieter. 16 psi. I take it to 2000. Still only at 40 degrees. Oil pressure's dropping now, 11 psi-ish. I'm going to let it warm up and take another video when it's a bit hotter. Okay, so it's warming up a little bit. So the water gauge has climbed. The oil temperature is still less than 60 degrees, it hasn't started registering, and my oil pressure is hovering at less than 5 psi. You see the coolant temp is only 64 degrees, and if I rev it to 2000, we're not even hitting 10 psi at 2000 revs, and it's still not up to 80 degrees yet. Yeah, that's enough. So let's take a look at this hideous monstrosity. While the engine was away being looked at and the oil pressure being, or the lack of oil pressure being checked out, I'd had some spare time on my hands. I envisaged that when I get the engine back, I'd want us to run it for obviously for longer periods, and I couldn't do that because I didn't have much of an exhaust. I'd already made the downpipe from bits of scrap that I had, and also like the main centre section, so I could fabricate the tunnel in the floor of the car. But then it stopped just short of the rear axle about here. Now the plan is, when the car's back up and running again, to ship the car off to somewhere like Simpson or somebody else to have the exhaust custom made for the car out of 3-inch stainless. But until that time, I do want to run it, and I can't run it with an open pipe because it's too freaking loud. So, like I say, I had a bit of stainless wire and some argon gas, and I had a bunch of just bits, really, no longer than 6 inches, any of them, of 3-inch stainless pipe, all in a big bin bag. And so I concocted this abortion. So don't slag me, okay? It is just a mock-up, and it's just for the purposes of running the car up initially until I get one made. But this bit here, there's going to be a intermediate silencer before the axle. It's then going to go over the axle, and when I get it made, I'm hoping to get that done in oval to squash that section down a bit and give me a bit more clearance over the axle. Then it's going to come round to a silencer that's going to run widthways across the car and then out to the rear valance. This was a horrible booyaka fucking 4-inch pipe or something off a I don't know, probably a Subaru, or more likely a Vauxhall Corsa that spends its nights in McDonald's picking up local 12-year-olds. But anyway, it all come to me for free with the engine and gearbox package. And so I thought, well, rather than spending money, I might as well hack it up and practice my stainless welding. At least that way, when the engine comes back and I can fire it up, I can have the engine running, I can get the coolant up to temperature and not piss the neighbours off too much. So there you go. That's the one and only time you're going to see that thing before it gets cut up to scrap and weighed in. Right then, I've got the engine back from Bareham. Another 4-hour trip down there on the M5 on a Friday, and a 4-hour trip back, so that was fun. Found the problem, and of quickly resolved it. And the problem was the oil pump. It was the pressure relief valve in the oil pump had stuck. I'll show you a diagram and explain that to you in a sec. While it was apart, they took the crankshaft out, measured all the journals, because I was concerned that it had been run at low pressure, albeit for only a few minutes. You know, it was a bloody expensive engine rebuild, and I wanted to make sure I hadn't done any damage by running it at such low pressure. The fact was that there was plenty of oil everywhere. It just wasn't at a very high pressure, and because I didn't rev it, or it wasn't under boost, I mean, it didn't go above like 2,000 or 3,000 revs anyway, and it was only for a couple of minutes, and most of that time, 90% of that time, was idling while I was doing the coolant and checking for leaks and stuff like that. They had the crankshaft out, measured all the journals and the big ends and the mains. Everything was perfect. Because he had them on the shelf anyway, he fitted brand new shelves for me in both the big end and the mains, all new oil seals and all new gaskets, and put it back together and tested it. I'm sorry for the wobbly camera. So when he got there, the first thing he did was he put some oil in the sump, hooked up his mechanical gauge, and used his drill to power the oil pump via the shaft underneath the distributor, and all he was getting was like half a bar of oil pressure, which is about 7 psi, which is clearly not right. After they'd fixed it, they didn't actually replace the pump. It's an off-the-shelf pump. I could have had another one just as bad. So what they elected to do, and I think it was the right thing to do, was to measure the bore and hone it out. I'll explain that bit to you in a bit. So this is an exploded diagram of the two-wheel drive Cosworth oil pump. You can't buy genuine pumps anymore. You haven't been able to buy them for about 30 years. So you're stuck with a choice of an old pump or a remanufactured one. They pretty much all come from the same source, although everybody sells them at different prices. Mine happen to come from Burton's, where most of the parts come to Bearing engines for Cosworths. They don't just plonk it on, knowing that they're a pattern part. They do a bit of due diligence, and they'll take this cover off here with a few screws, and they'll check for any flashing in the bore of the cast body. This is an aluminium casting, so they check for any flashing that might be hanging around through bad manufacturing processes, and they also check the rotor and the gear with feeler gauges, checking all the tolerances, and they put it all back together. The problem I had was this here. This is the pressure relief valve, and it's hidden behind this. For one, it's a gallery plug, just like a core plug that you bang in, and you never see it again really. And it just consists of a piston and a spring, and it travels up this bore in the oil pump. And what happens is the rotor turns around, it generates pressure in the gallery. The pressure of the oil sits behind this piston and pushes against this spring. Now if there's too much oil pressure, it goes up the bore and it uncovers a port, and the excessive oil spills out and it goes back into the sump harmlessly. And that pressure is around 5 bar. So what should happen is you spin the oil pump, your oil pressure will hit about 5 bar. It'll open that port, it'll bypass, and then quickly it'll come back under the pressure of this spring, and it sort of regulates the pressure of the pump so it can't exceed 5 bar, and it typically sits around 4.5 bar, which is around 65 psi. What was found to have happened in my pump was the piston went up the bore and got stuck. So there must have been a taper in the bore, because there wasn't any shit in there. There wasn't any flashing or any debris. So it was just a poorly machined oil pump that was all hidden behind this gallery plug. And that's how shit my luck was. So after discovering that, they elected not to fit a replacement pump. As I explained, I could have had another one with just the same problem. So they honed the bore that the pressure relief valve travels in. They honed it out to size correctly, and checked all the gaps and checked the operation, put it back together, refilled the sump with oil again, and did the same test with the same drill, and the same gauge, and it shot straight up to 5 bar, which is about 76 psi, and then quickly come back down to its running pressure of about 4.5 bar, which is about 65 psi, and that demonstrates the pressure relief valve feeling the pressure, opening, and then bypassing at its normal level to 4.5 bar. So it was deemed all good. Like I say, they put it back together with all new seals and gaskets, and here it is now, and I'm ready to start preparing to throw it back in the car. Right then, motor's on the ground, gearbox is on, and it's ready to slip under the car. I'll just take you through what I've been doing there. So with the engine suspended on the crane, I could remove the engine stands, and then while it's under there, while I'm under there, I'll refit the cross member. And what I've done is I've made some plates up and bolted some casters on, and that's the engine sitting on the cross member with a couple of casters where it would normally bolt to the chassis. And then I've done the same to the gearbox. On the gearbox mount, I made a couple of plates and put some 6-inch casters on there, and then I just literally slid the box onto the back of the engine. It all lined up, and it's a piece of piss. It's a big heavy gearbox, and it's going to be a right bastard trying to fit the box on the car because it's so fucking heavy. So it's much easier to do it this way and fit it all in one. So then what's going to happen, because the engine and box is on casters and the body shell's lifted up on the sill stands at the front, and I put the back axle on blocks at the back, I can swing the whole engine and box assembly underneath the car, and it clears the cross member. So with the engine and box sitting on the floor on its casters in the engine bay, I then get the crane, hook it to the top of the engine and lift it up from underneath into position, and then just put my cross member bolts in. And that way I don't risk trying to submarine the engine and gearbox, or even just the engine on its own, into the engine bay and risk damaging any paint. This way it takes a bit longer, but it's physically easier, it's technically easier, and it's the least risk of damage to the paint. Now, to get it in that way, a lot of stuff's got to come off the engine, because the engine's wider than the chassis rails. Okay, the inner wings taper down on both sides, so it'd be easy just to plop it in from the top, but it's swinging around, and I don't want to risk damaging any of the paintwork. So yeah, alternator bracket, all that's got to come off from this area. The turbo can stay on. It'd be easy with it off, but because of the location of the manifold bolts, it'd be an absolute cunt of a job, basically, to fit the turbo and the manifold with the engine in situ. So it's much easier to do it off the car and plock it up from underneath, or even down from the top, either way, but leave the turbo on. That's the main thing. The whole inlet assembly's got to come off, and then obviously all the associated pipes and bits and bobs to connect it up. In order to swing the engine underneath the car, I've got to remove all the suspension just on the one side. All the anti-roll bar and the steering rack's got to come off, obviously, because the steering rack's bolted to the cross member. But the strut's got to come off, and then I've just hooked the brake caliper up in the wheel arch, so it's not doing any harm. It's not stretching the hose. So slide the engine underneath, and then once it's up and the cross member's in place, I can re-bolt all the suspension. Re-bolt, is that a word? Anyway, I've just made it up. So there we go. So next clip you see, fingers crossed, should be that lot inside that bugger. Right then, the engine's back in. It's all connected up. I've connected up all the coolant lines and the inlet and it's ready to rock now basically. There's just a bit of prep to do before we go for the initial startup. One of the good things about the Cosworth and the Pinto engines is that you can actually prime the oil pump and get the oil pressure up and around the engine without having to crank the engine over and like turning the crank and the cams and everything else when they're dry. So you can get all the oil there first, and that's because of this. This is the distributor. It would be on a Pinto. On a Cosworth, particularly on this Cosworth with call-on plug ignition, it's a phase sensor. You can just see in there, there's just a pickup that goes round. Normally they have two, but because I'm running a 36:1 ignition trigger on the crankshaft, I only need one. So I've ground one of the lobes off. So anyway, the auxiliary drive at the front of the engine, driven off the crank and essentially the cam belt, that auxiliary drive drives this cog, which turns the distributor or the phase sensor. In turn, inside, up to the centre of it, is a hexagonal hole, and that's because you've got a shaft. This is an Allen key, but you know, you get the idea. So a hexagonal shaft goes up the inside of the Z, like that, okay, and as the cog, as the auxiliary drive shaft driven by the cam belt turns this cog and then turns your phase sensor, it spins this shaft, which goes all the way down into the bottom of the sump, into the oil pump. That's how it normally works. So what you can do is you can pop out the distributor, and then with a contraption like this, which is a few extensions, just quarter drive extensions with a 6mm socket on, you can pop that down the hole and drive the shaft with a drill on the other end, pop it on there, and you can effectively pump oil all around the engine without the engine cranking over. It primes the oil pump, it picks up oil from the sump up into the pickup pipe obviously, and then distributes it all over the engine without anything rotating really, apart from the oil pump. That's the only thing that's moving, and that's lubricated because it's full of oil anyway. At the same time, you can pop a pressure gauge on and measure your oil pressure and make sure you've got oil pressure. As we know, I had nearly a catastrophic problem last time because the oil pump was faulty, and we found it got fixed really well. The engine supplier was great. They fixed that little problem. It's now back, it's in, and just as a, you know, just for safety really, I just want to double check that I've primed the oil pump before I go for a startup, and there's plenty of oil, and there's plenty of oil pressure crucially. So it's going to be a bit awkward to try and show you because I've only got one pair of hands, but I'm going to attempt to turn the engine over, turn the oil pump over via the 6mm shaft, hex shaft, and a drill and a few extensions, and I've got an oil pressure gauge hooked up ready, and we'll see how much pressure I'm pumping. Let's have a go. So engine's back in, all the suspension's back on, the steering, the brakes, radiator, intercooler, inlet, it's all in, ready to rock. Here's the bits I was talking about earlier. So this is the auxiliary pulley, okay, that drives a shaft which drives the cog on the distributor, and the distributor or the phase sensor fits down this hole. And if I can get the camera down there, there you go, so you can see the hexagonal shaft, if it focuses, in the middle of that hole. Okay, and you can also see the corner of the gear from the auxiliary pulley. So as I said earlier, that gear drives the gear on the distributor, and then that hexagonal shaft goes up the centre of the distributor, one end, and the other end goes down to the pump and spins the pump. So let's get my socket on. I'll spin it round with my drill, and we'll see how much pressure, if any, I'm getting on this oil pressure gauge. Now last time I did this is a stone cold engine with 2050 mineral braking oil fitted. This is what Cosworth recommends in their workshop manual, and I should be seeing around 40 psi at these kind of RPMs. Last time it was floating between 20 and 30 maybe if I rev the drill up a bit. With a high pressure pump I'm expecting to see a lot more. Right, I'm going to pop the drill on and spin the oil pump. Well, that's a bloody success, isn't it? Well over 4 bar, approaching 5 bar, which is, well, that's awesome. I'm really happy with that. So now I'm going to do a few bits and bobs and let's prep the engine for a start. Okay, that mock-up exhaust is on the car, so before we fire it up, let's have a poke underneath and have a look at it. I wanted to keep it as low profile as possible, hence the tunnel. So if we go down the side, you can see the chassis rail, and you can see the other side of the chassis rail before you can see the exhaust. It's probably a bit easier to see underneath, so let's go under. Okay, so we're underneath. Obviously you can see the engine and box are fitted now, or the front suspension. If I just pull back, this bit here cleverly converts the cable output of this T5 gearbox. Speedo fitting is exactly the same as the Type 9 Sierra 5-speed as it is with the Type 5 Sierra Cosworth engine, so that's good to know. I made up a little adapter, and this is off a Ford KA, and basically it turns around and just sends impulses to my electric Speedo, so that's cool. I'm just about to fit the prop, which is why I'm underneath the car really. So this is just a yoke to stop the oil pissing out. There's the handbrake mech. You can see I've put it over to one side. It's offset so I can get the prop as high in the transmission tunnel, or the prop shaft tunnel rather, as I can, to so I can get plenty of ground clearance and get the car low. So if I shuffle back, there you go, you can see how I've managed to get that big 3-inch drain pipe of an exhaust tucked right up, and then it comes back, and this section here just before the diff, that's probably a bad angle. Let me flip around. So here I am, flipped around. Just a couple of bobbins to make the silence the system, and then I've got a flat section here. I've modified the floor under the rear passenger seat, so I'm hoping to have like a little intermediate silencer there, more of a resonator box. Then it's going to go over the axle, and where it goes over here, I want this to be in oval section, so it'll be wider but narrower to give me a lot more clearance over the axle. And it comes down and it runs the widthways of the car. As I said, don't slag me welding, it's only a mock-up. All the haters out there, chill your beans. So yeah, I'm going to have an oval silencer running widthways rather than this round horrible thing, which will give me a bit more clearance. And if we look from the back end, I modified the balance with that's a 4-inch radius there, so it gives a nice gap around the 3-inch pipe. Like I say, it's only mocked up. So yeah, that's how the silencer is going to run across the width of the car. Obviously it's going to be a lot neater, a lot prettier, but that's the basic exhaust run, and that'll allow me to fire the engine up, do all my setting up, all my little pissing about jobs without freaking the neighbours out and without burning any exhaust valves out because I'm running an open pipe. So there you go. Right then, we're pretty much ready to start it up. I've just been I've set the base timing, which is something you have to do with a new ECU. So with the engine all at top dead centre and the crank lined up, I'm using an old strobe light to pick up the light at top dead centre, and instead of, obviously I can't go with the spark plug wires because I've got these call on plugs, so the pickup just goes over this one. Some strobe lights work like this, some don't. Fortunately this one does. It's an old Gunson Super Strobe. It's a bit of a beast. It was my dad's. My dad had it for years, and Dad's not here anymore, but he left it to me and I'm making good use of it, and it works a treat. So I've just been cranking it over on the starter with the plugs out, and I've got my base timing value, and I've thumped it into the link ECU. I've set up my phase sensor, so now the ECU knows exactly where the crank is and exactly where the cams are. Got my oil pressure gauge all hooked up. Hopefully let's hope for some good oil pressure. The engine's stone cold. Got my hand on the exhaust there, and this is genuinely the first time I'm going to start it up in anger after solving all those problems out, and I've got a couple of more bits to do inside, and I'll grab the camera and I'll take you in, and let's walk through them, eh? So here we are in the office. I've got my laptop next to me, a little funky table, and we'll key on the ignition. So the fuel pump runs, that's a good start. So just to take you through my clocks, these are gauges that I got from Speed Hut in the States. I had them custom made to my design. We've got a speedo which is driven electronically off the T5 gearbox, the tacho with some programmable shift lights, and this multi-gauge which has got the water temperature on the left, and the fuel pressure is on the right. At the top is volts, and at the bottom is my fuel level. And then mounted in the center console, I've got a boost gauge over here, tick-tock clock, oil pressure gauge. That's the one we're interested in today. You remember the last time I fired this engine up, it was pretty poor, hovering around 20 psi when the engine was stone cold, eventually dropping down to less than 10 when it warmed up. Is when I killed the ignition and we found the problem. It was a dodgy oil pump. That's all been fixed, engine's back in, we're ready to rock again, and this is all temperature. So on the laptop I just need to so this is my link ECU screen. I've already mapped my throttle position sensor, which is here. So as I put my foot on the throttle pedal in and out, you can see the gauge going up and down. So I've programmed it to tell it where 0 is and where wide open is, which is a good start. So now the ECU knows all the crank positions, and I've mapped I've calibrated rather the manifold air pressure sensor and a few other bits and bobs. So we're going to go to start up, and we'll be looking at this gauge, which is engine RPM and oil pressure. Well, let's do it, eh? So tick over's a bit low. But already you can see, look at that oil pressure, 80 psi at tick over, and if I rev it, oh, that is superb. That is really good news. So that is the oil pressure relief valve doing its job, and and relieving the pressure so it doesn't, not too much. So you'll notice when I rev it, it sort of peaks at about 90, then it'll start bypassing. Yeah, it's in my throttle position. I'm hardly touching that. So yeah, my alternator's working because I've got 14 volts up there. Engine coolant temperature is 35, cold. Air intake temperature, that's my throttle position sensor. You'll see that climb up and go down again. Manifold air pressure, this is my this is the revs basically. That's my idling at about 990. The engine's still cold, so that's about right. And the oil pressure's floating at around 78 psi, which is about 4 times as much oil pressure as I was getting before. So it's quite safe to say I've fixed the problem. Let's go outside and check that motor. So already it's a lot quieter mechanically, which is great. And I've still got my manual oil pressure gauge hooked up. Yeah, absolutely plenty of pressure. Last time, you remember, it was down here somewhere. If I grab my throttle and give it a rev, engine sounds sweet, nice and quiet. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put my dad's old strobe back on and just double check my ignition timing. Right then, I'm going to see if we can get a good, if I can able to video strobe and other timing marks. To be fair, air filters off to get me a bit of clearance. I'm going to point the strobe down there. The pointer on the crankshaft is just in line with the radiator hose clip for the bottom hose, and we can see the mark in between the two pulleys. So let's have a go. There you go. Okay, so my ignition time is spot on. Let me remove the strobe light and I can refit the air filter. There we go, air filter's back on. That is sweet. I am so happy, genuinely. It doesn't sound as loud as I thought it would either. Not even with my my rotary exhaust. That's a bit of steam. It's obviously still cold. Yeah. No oil or black smoke. Happy days. Right then, it's been about 30 minutes now. The engine's been running. It's got up to temperature. The fans will come on. I've bled the coolant, turned it off, checked the oil, fired it back up again, ran it again. The oil pressure when the engine's up to temp, the coolant temp's around 80 degrees C. I've checked the Cosworth book, and the Cosworth book says I should see a minimum of 26 psi. It's not dropping below 42 psi at all. Even when the fans come on, it was about 95 degrees C. And at 2000 RPM I should see 35 psi according to the book, and I'm seeing in excess of 60 psi at 2000 RPM when it's hot. So I've now got plenty of oil pressure. The engine's much quieter, and I'm really happy. Really happy. That was a big worry. To be fair to the engine builder, their response was perfect. I rang them up, told them I had a problem. I said, send it back, Lee, we'll sort it out. They did exactly that. They got to the root cause of the problem. It was as I said earlier on, it was the pressure relief valve within the oil pump. Now the oil pump's just a bought-in part. They take it off the shelf. They do check it, and they checked it there. But there was no way they could have found it, because I checked it when I got here. I span it up with a drill, like I showed you earlier, and it was showing plenty of pressure. It was only when the engine's under running pressure that the pump pumps enough pressure to stick that valve, pressure relief valve, right at the top of its bore, and that's when the problem occurred. So they could not have known about it, and in any case they took it back, they sorted it out, they've took the crank out, they've checked all the shelves, checked all the mains, replaced them all because they had them on the shelf. There's nothing wrong with them, but they fitted new ones anyway. They fitted all new seals, all new gaskets, and got the engine back to me as quickly as they could. They did it all while I was on holiday, which was great. So you couldn't ask for a better response, and to me that's the true measure how you rate a company. It's not when things go good, because things go good 90% of the time. It's how do they sort it out if things don't go so good. And in this case, like, I couldn't have asked for a better response. So I mean, that's pretty much a good time to wrap up the end of this video. It's on to the next stages, and it's a bit of tinkering around. I can take that gauge off. Don't need a mechanical gauge anymore. I know that it correlates well with my electric gauge, so I know that they're calibrated. I don't need to run that. I can refit my strut brace. The bonnet can go back on. I can refit my prop shaft, which I had to take out when I dropped the engine and gearbox, and connect up the handbrake mechanism, and then it's going to be off to go and get an exhaust made for it. I knocked up rather a ropey one just so I could have it running without the neighbours screaming at me. You know, it's only one box, but it seems to have subdued it quite a lot. But next it's time to have that exhaust made. So thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts. Hope you enjoyed it. Give us a comment and a like on the video, and I'll see you next time.